Blinken knew exactly what he was doing. He could have delayed the release, but he chose instead to release the State Department's 2023 country report on the eve of his arrival in China. Wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes on China. There's plenty of media coverage on what he came for, the messages he wanted to deliver, but the main thrust of his first day was a wave of media reports on what he felt about China's human rights record. In a 1,283-word preface signed by Blinken, there are 49 words related to China, but these 49 words achieved all the media attention. They were, and I quote, "The report documents ongoing grave human rights abuses in the People's Republic of China. For example, in Xinjiang, the PRC continues to carry out genocide, crimes against humanity, forced labor, and other human rights violations against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups." So, end of quote. Apparently, we're to believe there's still a genocide going on in China, despite there never having been a body, a death camp, no logistic supports. Such a campaign couldn't exist. There are no witnesses to and no evidence of such an event. And as a resident of China, I don't know if any of the other 199 countries, territories, or regions where the US decided to report on issues are correct. But one thing I know with absolute certainty is that the information they have on China is not correct. Even they admit this in the opening paragraph of the document that relates to China, or the page that relates to China, where they say, and I quote, "In many instances, few or no details were available." Well, if few or no details were available, that might account for why they have reports, allegations, but never evidence, never proof, only allegations. And to this day, not one member of the US Department of State has visited the region, despite many invitations to do so. But it gets worse. There are no sources of any repute. One of the allegations of forced organ transplants is Epoch Times, the Falun Gong newspaper. One quote relating to violence and harassments of journalists actually says, quote, "Sources refuse to meet journalists," unquote. The report damns China because they say NGOs are required to provide information on their sources of funding. That's something the US and almost every country has required for many years, as if this was something unusual. There's further incredulity as the State Department seems to have problems with a relatively new Chinese law which actually allows the government to monitor, defend, and handle cybersecurity risks and threats originating from within the country or overseas sources. And China has criminalized the use of the internet to create or disseminate false information to disrupt the economic or social order. This is coming from the country that has just voted on a law to force the sale of or ban the use of TikTok's social media app. Hypocrisy indeed, especially when clear abuse of their own recognition of the one China policy. The report treats Taiwan as a separate country and summarizes Taiwan's page with, "Authorities enforced laws prohibiting human rights abuses and prosecuting officials who committed them." That's a direct quote. It goes on for pages and pages of trite, asinine assertions that Taiwan is free of corruption, free of any abuses. It has a strong rule of law and, in fact, is a place every law-abiding citizen could feel happy without any fear of abuse, authoritarianism, and even those who are in prison get a fair shake. It looks like the perfect place to live, if only it were a country. Let's forget China and put that aside for the moment. There are some considerations that need to be looked at. One is that the US has no right to be interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. Any sovereign nation, let alone all of them. The United Nations has made it clear that unilateral interference in the affairs of sovereign states must yield to dialogue. I've linked that. Having said that, if China or any other country is engaged in genocide, it would be beholden on all of us to engage and prevent the continuation, which begs the question, why haven't the US engaged with China? Why haven't they sent people to China to look at Xinjiang? Why aren't they presenting evidence to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court and supporting those allegations with evidence? The answer is simple. They don't have any. Now, if we were to look inwards at the United States, we'd find what their media doesn't tell us. It isn't China that is the problem. It is indeed the land of the free and the home of the brave, which really is in deep hot water with the United Nations. The United Nations commissioned Human Rights Watch to create a country report. I'm no fan of Human Rights Watch, and I prefer not to cite them when I'm talking about China. But the 2024 country report they issued for the United Nations, because the UN aren't allowed to send rapporteurs to the USA, matches and aligns with a similar report issued by the US-based International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in November of last year. Now, in summary of that report, one of the authors wrote, again, I quote, "The United States touts itself as a beacon of democracy and human rights, yet the committee's findings prove that this could not be further from the truth, underscoring the critical need to prioritize and strengthen human rights at home and establish a national human rights institution to ensure that our most basic rights are protected." In other words, not only is Blinken coming to China with messages that might not be well received, he's wrapping them in lies that deflect from his own country's shortcomings. Perhaps the message that China would like to or should give him will go something like this. Instead of looking at China for an imaginary genocide, the International Court of Justice has already told you where to look. There's a real one in Gaza today. Instead of looking elsewhere for forced labor, corrupt governance, racial inequality, mass shootings, hate speech, sexual and gender discrimination, increasing poverty, and inaccessible or unaffordable health care, check inside your own borders where they all currently exist. Instead of looking outside of America for law enforcement violations and authoritarian police control, look inward where your police kill 3 people every day on average, and you have the world's largest prison population. Instead of looking at Russia, where there are allegations of separating children from their parents in a war zone, look at the southern border, where over 5,000 such cases have been documented and proven. Instead of blaming China for pollution, look at your own history and your current actions, because China is producing your goods and reducing pollution, while the US is producing nothing except weapons and increasing pollution. Instead of accusing others of not having democracy, take a look at your own, where there is legalized corruption in the form of lobbying, where even Princeton University admits your democracy doesn't serve the people, where there is proven voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, voters' restriction, and burdensome voter ID requirements. And it has policies with a disproportionate impact on low-income voters, persons with disabilities, and racial and ethnic minorities. The committee that wrote this report also criticized disenfranchisement laws targeting those who have felony convictions and the role of dark money in elections, and where the peaceful transition of power failed miserably at your last election. Now let's go overseas and look at how many legally innocent people have been killed in drone attacks. How many uncharged people have been arrested and renditioned, which is a nice word for kidnapped, and taken to another country where they can be legally tortured and held without charge for 20 years. In its summary, the report concludes with these damning words. The breadth of US violations of the ICCPR is overwhelming. The committee found breaches of the treaty in nearly every aspect of life in the United States. We should heed the committee's recommendations and demand that our federal, state, and local governments in the US comply with our human rights obligations. And to be honest, the Human Rights Watch report wasn't a lot better. Every finger that points outwards from the US has 3 fingers pointing inward. Just remember that next time Blinken mentions human rights abuses in China, which are never, ever proven. Thank you for watching my take on China, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.